The respiratory system starts developing during week 4 of intrauterine life, when a lung bud sprouts out of the primitive digestive tract. The lung bud's an outgrowth of the foregut portion of the digestive tract, and it turns into lower respiratory tract structures like the larynx, trachea, and lungs. Around week 4, the embryo has developed all 3 embryonic germ layers, and of the 3, respiratory tract structures arise from the endoderm and mesoderm. Now, the larynx starts developing at the beginning of week 4, as nothing more than a slit between the 4th and 6th pharyngeal arches. The pharyngeal arches are paired, symmetrical embryonic structures that sprout from the foregut and arch towards the embryo's front midline. They consist of a mesoderm core, and that mesoderm is made up mostly of mesenchyme, which is a soupy, fetal tissue that eventually turns into circulatory tissue, lymphatic tissue, and musculoskeletal tissue. The arches are covered on the outside by a pharyngeal cleft, made of ectoderm, and lined on the inside with a pharyngeal pouch, made of endoderm. In fish, these arches develop into gills, but in our case they serve as a foundation for many important structures around the head and neck. Now, the endoderm of the 4th and 6th pharyngeal arches forms the laryngeal epithelium and glands, and the mesoderm forms the laryngeal cartilages, while the arches themselves carry the laryngeal branches of the vagus nerve to these structures. All in all, these 2 arches give us our ability to talk. In week 5, a laryngeal orifice forms, which is a T-shaped opening which leads to the larynx. The epithelium inside the larynx turns into laryngeal ventricles, which give rise to the vocal cords. In week 6, the epiglottis forms, and in week 12, the laryngeal opening has its adult shape, as well as the thyroid, cricoid, and arytenoid cartilages. Now, let's switch gears and look at the trachea and lungs. During week 4, 2 tracheo-esophageal ridges grow towards one another and then fuse into a septum that divides the foregut into 2 regions, a posterior esophagus and an anterior lung bud. In the core, the lung bud has endoderm, which develops into the epithelial and glandular structures of the trachea and lungs. And around the core, it has visceral mesoderm, which develops into the muscles, cartilages, and connective tissue. Now, the lung bud basically just hangs off the foregut, and at its loose end, it bifurcates into 2 bronchial buds. These bronchial buds give rise to the lungs, which grow and develop inside the pleural cavities. And those bronchial buds develop into lungs in 4 stages. The first stage is the pseudoglandular stage, and it lasts from week 5 to week 16. During this time, the bronchial buds divide into a left and right main bronchus, and these divide again into 3 secondary bronchi for the 3 right lung lobes, and 2 secondary bronchi for the 2 left lung lobes. Secondary bronchi turn into 10 tertiary bronchi on the right side, and 8 on the left side, corresponding to the number of lung segments on either side. Tertiary bronchi divide repeatedly until all the terminal bronchioles are formed. So now the lungs enter the second stage of development, called the canalicular stage. It lasts from week 16 to week 26, and during this time the terminal bronchioles continue to divide and form the respiratory bronchioles. Each respiratory bronchiole then divides into 3 to 6 alveolar ducts. Also at this point, a bunch of pulmonary capillaries start to form, and this makes the lungs highly vascular organs. Starting with week 24, the first primitive alveoli appear in the lung regions closer to the trachea. These alveoli, though, are immature, in the sense that they have a lining of cuboidal epithelial cells that's not perfectly adapted to gas exchange just yet, and there still isn't that many of them. Next is the third stage, called the terminal sac stage. This lasts from week 26 to birth, and during this time more primitive alveoli, sometimes called terminal sacs, form around each alveolar duct. In addition, the epithelial lining differentiates into either type 1 or type 2 pneumocytes, and more capillaries form around the primitive alveoli. Type 1 pneumocytes are flat cells that are in direct contact with the capillaries. At the point where the endothelium of the capillaries meets that of the type 1 pneumocytes, the blood-air barrier forms, which also includes the basement membrane in between. Type 2 pneumocytes also form, and these are large, cuboidal cells that produce pulmonary surfactant. Surfactant is a fluid whose name is actually short for surface active agent, because it decreases surface tension at the blood-air barrier. And it does this by lowering the attractive forces between water molecules in the alveoli. This allows the lungs to fill up with air more easily. And it also prevents the collapse of the tiny alveoli during expiration. The fourth and final stage is the alveolar stage, and it lasts from week 36 to about 8 years after birth. So the lungs keep developing for a pretty long time. The alveolar stage overlaps with the terminal sac stage for about 4 weeks. During the alveolar stage, thin walls called septa partition the primitive alveoli, giving rise to a lot more adult alveoli, and the number of respiratory bronchioles also increases. To help put this in perspective, we're born with about 20 to 70 million primitive alveoli. And by the age of 8 years old, that number increases to 300 to 400 million alveoli. Now, one final point is that fetal breathing movements actually start before birth, and this is so the lungs and the respiratory muscles can learn how to work together. Since there's no air in the uterus, the fetus breathes in amniotic fluid. At birth, when the baby takes its first breath, that fluid gets reabsorbed into the pulmonary capillaries, and this leaves behind a layer of surfactant on the alveolar cell membranes. In premature babies, lung function depends heavily on how much surfactant's been produced already. Alright, as a quick recap, the respiratory system starts developing during week 4 of pregnancy, and it's mature enough so that a premature baby can breathe on its own by 28 weeks. The larynx is completely formed by week 12, and it's formed by the 4th and 6th pharyngeal arches. The lungs and trachea develop from the lung bud, starting with week 4, and the lungs mature in 4 stages: the pseudoglandular period, the canalicular period, the terminal sac period, and the alveolar period. During the last 2 stages, type 2 pneumocytes secrete alveolar surfactant, which prevents the alveoli from collapsing during expiration.